Hello and welcome to the Ros Savage Project podcast. My name is Ros Savage and today I'm speaking to you from New Haven in Connecticut.
And I'm Vic Phillipson and I'm in Kristiansand, Norway.
And today we are on week 9 of our class on courage, the first week in the second half of the semester. And today it was all about non-conformity.
Huh. And courage lies in non-conformity?
Well, we'll get on to that. It is quite interesting because, we had an earlier week that was about intellectual courage.
Yes.
And that's sort of a part of this, that when you're going to say, hold on a moment, everybody, I'm not sure that we're going the right way about this. It does take a certain amount of courage. Well, certainly for me, it takes courage. I know some people just seem to have the challenging gene, don't they? That, if you say black is black, they'll say it's white. But I think for most of us, it's easier often to go along with the status quo. And it's harder to stick our head above the parapet and say, I'm not sure this is the way we should be doing this.
Yeah.
And I think there's sort of an idealization of nonconformity in Western society, particularly. In Japan and many other Asian cultures, they're much more likely to want to fit in. Isn't it something like 90% of Japanese want to be just like everybody else? But here in the Western Hemisphere, we tend to idealize the nonconformist. I don't know how much of it to blame on that classic Apple commercial from 1997 about the square pegs in the round holes and all of that, which we did look at today. That was what our class was all about this morning, was looking at nonconformity from several different perspectives, and it all got really interesting, actually.
Yeah,
but first of all, Vic, well, you tell me first, what sort of associations come up for you when you think about nonconformity?
Oh, hippies. No, really, honestly. I mean, that was the first, when the word non-conformity became a part of the Umgangssprache, the everyday speech.
And again in English. Oh, yes.
Everyday speech. That's when it would have became part of that, was the early part of the 70s, late 60s, to be a nonconformist.
That's quite interesting, and I think that alludes to one of the points that came up this morning, which is, I suppose, when the first few nonconformists become nonconforming, they are indeed nonconformists, but, the hippie movement actually became huge, didn't it? Mm-hmm. And so after a certain tipping point, then weren't you actually conforming to the non-conforming hippie vibe?
Yeah. Pretty soon it became you had to have flared jeans and
long hair.
And my dad, 1970. I have pictures of my dad in 1971 with the sideburns and long hair, right?
Which probably in the late 60s or whenever that look first came in was considered pretty outrageous, but then became almost de rigueur.
Yeah, suddenly in Bloomington, Nebraska, you had to have longer hair than you'd had ever in your life, and sideburns, yes, became de rigueur. You could say that. My mother hated it. She hated all of it. Oh, she hated it so much.
Well, I think so do most people when they look back at their photos from 1971. They're wondering why on earth that ever looked like a good look. But do you see what I mean? That, in fact, there was a point that came up this morning that even when you're non-conforming, you're probably still conforming to something else in a way.
Oh, yeah, you have to. There's some societal mean that you're trying to measure up against.
Yeah. And so there was actually quite a funny article in The Onion, this sort of satirical online magazine, which was obviously a spoof, because that's all they do. But it was about the immense pressure on high school students to be non-conforming, and that any conformists actually got bullied for not conforming to the non-conforming.
I think it's become so confusing about what confirmation is. What are you a part of? Yeah, there are so many
Mm.
different groups and tribes and cliques that we belong to in our lives, and I think for kids too. Which look are you supposed to cultivate? It's very hard.
And I think there's something important there about such an overused word, but authenticity. Some people are genuinely just different. One of the examples we looked at was Einstein, who I think really did think in a different way from most of us. From what I've read about the way his mind worked, he was much more visual. He didn't really think in words or even in numbers. It was much more in images. And we look at him. So the reason he didn't cut his hair very much was not because he wanted to look like a mad professor, although maybe that was a useful side benefit. But it was because he just said long hair doesn't need cutting so often, and he didn't want to waste his time getting his hair cut. And the reason he stopped wearing socks was because apparently he had exceptionally long, big toes that would just stick themselves through socks in a matter of minutes. And I suppose he got fed up wasting time going on regular trips to the sock shop.
Yeah. I
So,
just read an article about him that maybe one of the reasons that he was able to, in that the magic year of 1905 when he publishes the three most important papers in mathematics history, is that prior to that he was working as a clerk, and that because he had a very conformist job. I mean, he was in a Swiss bureaucracy as a clerk. Could there be anything that you'd have to conform more to? But
I doubt it.
but paradoxically, the reason that because he was so constricted and what he was doing was essentially incredibly boring, it gave him time to have flights of fancy and to get outside of himself, because he was not allowed much freedom in his professional life. And so he had this time when he was a clerk and he wasn't under a great deal of pressure to perform intellectually, that he had his private time, his private sphere. Then he was able to really focus on what he was doing, because the other things he was doing was so regimented and square. Yeah.
And yet some people, I still think that he was quite unique, because some people, when they are in that regimented a structure, an organization or a lifestyle, that's who they become. He seems to have used it as an opportunity to allow his imagination to really run riot. But for other people, it would just be stultifying in all aspects of their lives.
Yeah, but I don't think that he starts to become really nonconformist until much later in his life. He's pretty there in the beginning. And actually, when he has his great breakthroughs, he's kind of living the life. He's married, isn't he? He has children. Later he leaves his wife and children and runs off with a cousin. He's madly in love with a cousin, and he has to get who is it Fermi that gets on the train with him and talks him into staying with his wife. It's a crazy story, but that's much later. That's after World War I. So this is that's another 15 years later. So.
Can I pick up on a couple of things there? It just reminds me, tell me if I've told you about this before, but there's a British autistic couple called Gilbert and George, and every day they eat dinner. They have the same thing for breakfast every day, same thing for lunch every day. In the evening, they will go to the same restaurant and have the same menu option as they've had for, maybe the previous month. I think once in a while they will switch to a new restaurant. They wear suits every day, same suits. And the whole idea behind this is that they want all of their creative energy, all of their imagination, all of their attention really to go into their art. They don't want to be wasting time, a bit like Einstein. They don't want to be wasting time thinking about mere practicalities such as what to wear or what to eat. So there's that sort of saying about being boring in your routine to be spectacular in your creativity.
Right. Yeah. No. I would subscribe to that.
And the other thing that I wanted to pick up on was Certainly in my experience, and I've only had the one lifetime so far that I can remember, so it's not a broad statistical sample, but I find it is easier to be more yourself, whether that's non-conforming or whatever, as you get older. I know that in my teens and 20s, I desperately just wanted to fit in. And it's maybe because when I was a younger child, mum and dad were always moving house. And so I always felt like the odd one out. So I was so happy for those couple of decades to be just completely normal. And it was only when I got older that I discovered that completely normal wasn't working very well for me. And I think I love it when you get people who as they get older, they become more and more eccentric and cantankerous. And You know, if they don't like doing something, they'll just say so.
Or find another way to not do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Great privilege of age, I think. So maybe that was going on in Einstein's life as well.
I posted a photo not so long ago of my closet, the color palette in my closet. It's like 18 black T-shirts. It's because I just decided, I worked in the theater and all those years, why would I own anything else? Why would I even bother owning anything else? And now I have to go on board ships and I can't wear black T-shirts, so I have white button-down collar Oxford shirts. I have 5 of them.
And that's it. That's your closet.
And I have black Levi's 501 jeans that I wear to go on the ships. It's always the same. So I don't have to sort through anything. I always have the same thing. Twice a year.
Sounds like George Clooney in Up in the Air, was it?
Yes, yeah.
When he's the businessman and he has the closet full of identical,
exactly the same
white
thing.
T-shirts and
Don't have to worry about it then. Yeah.
I was going to say I wish I could do that, but I suppose I could. I mean, there's no reason why, as a woman, why should I have to spend that much more time shopping for clothes or choosing clothes or what's the best outfit for that occasion? And I sometimes get really grumpy about it.
Well, yeah, but sometimes it has to be interesting, at least, to think about those things.
Sometimes. Usually before a speaking engagement, though, I'm like, I haven't got a thing to wear. Nothing's quite right. And I sometimes envy nuns and monks that I suppose a good reason a habit is called a habit. Mm-hmm. It must make life so much simpler.
What did your kids have to say about nonconformity today? I mean, they're in, I think that's part of the as doing my conspiracy theory research. Of course, I have to listen to a lot of crazy people. And one of the crazy people that I listen to is just all up in the air about political correctness, and that the problem is that political correctness has become a real stifle on creativity on campus, particularly on campus. That the outrage machine that student organizations have become, in a way, keep particularly tenured professors who are scared to death they're going to make a pronoun slip and be ostracized and demonized because of that. So yeah.
Well, I ended up looking back. Oh, actually, there's a video that just came out recently about the Halloween furore on the Yale campus last year, which was really all about this. And I think if we talked about this briefly before, that an email went out asking students to be sensitive about how they chose to dress up at Halloween, and then the wife of the dean of one of the residential colleges felt that this was really going too far into personal freedom, and that students could actually be trusted to make a sound judgment call on their own Halloween costumes. And it all got very ugly, and both the dean and his wife ended up, she resigned completely and he resigned from some of his duties. So we did talk about that. We touched on that this morning. It would have really taken over the whole conversation. So we've said that we will talk about it, but we didn't dive all the way into that this morning. In a way, we almost need a dedicated session for that. Something that did come out, I think there was some resentment about the way that it had been reported in the press, that there'd been a very, as journalists are somewhat prone to do, there had been selection of facts to portray maybe a pre-existing opinion about the present generation of students and their, emotional fragility or whatever. But there was also a point that the events of last Halloween were sort of like in the systems thinking pyramid. That was the event, the tip of the iceberg, beneath which were the patterns and the institutional structures and the narratives that had really been building up towards that for quite some time. That what happened at Halloween was really the eruption of something that had been brewing for quite a time preceding that.
Yeah, but do you get a feeling that they feel constrained or limited or in their thinking or what they say, or do you have that sense of them? I don't know.
I think this morning, if anything, I was feeling more self-conscious about being politically correct. In fact, I'm not like dodging the question, but we went on to talk about conform on the spectrum of conformity to non-conformity, and this is being simplistic about it by necessity, but there's sort of a bell curve, as with most aspects of human psychology. There's a bell curve from the extremely conforming through the sort of comfortable majority out to the extremely non-conforming. And I'd found this entry in last year's what's the name of the publication? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Mm-hmm. That now, I don't know if this is due to a pharmaceutical company spotting an opportunity to create another drug, but oppositional defiant disorder, acronym ODD, with no sense of irony that I could detect, being defined as a mental illness, and the symptoms being described as an ongoing pattern of disobedient, hostile and defiant behaviour.
Yeah, that's I think that's applied to a lot of elementary school kids now.
Yeah, but well, that was quite interesting. If they are looking on that as a medicatable, if that's a word, condition, then when you try and bring people into the bell of the bell curve, you're still going to have outliers. Like, no matter how much you pull people to, you will still. It's just then the outliers are less extreme than they were without medication. But the reason that I mentioned that is that I was tying myself in knots trying to find politically correct terms for crazy people.
I didn't realize they'd become off. Off. You couldn't address the topic. It's just straight up crazy people. But I guess.
Well, there you go. You see, it came out so easily when I'm speaking to you. But
I think that's funny. It must be because one, I'm around teenage boys a lot. Not known for their great political correctness.
Yes.
And I live in a country where political correctness is almost antithetical to the language style here. There are words used in Norwegian that would get you thrown out of polite society in the United States, and everyone says them here without the bat of an eye.
Yeah.
And that is a true culture. So the when you are not in the culture, and when you see it from afar, and when you're around people who are not politically correct at all, even though I try and correct them and say, guys, you can't, please, come on. You're not as aware of it. I certainly am not as aware of it here.
Yeah. It's interesting because we probably do use quite a lot of mental energy in policing our own language. And there's probably a point at which sort of good manners and trying not to offend people just becomes I don't know, excessive, sort of fake in some way. Like you've got the word going through your head, but you're trying not to let it come out of your mouth.
Right.
But it's still there.
Yeah. Well, part of the beauty of being truly a stranger in a strange land, with two cultures involved, actually three cultures in this house, is that we're able to ignore all the societal norms in all three societies. We don't celebrate any of the Hallmark holidays, any of them. The Valentine's Day, the Mother's Days, because if we did, we'd have to celebrate three. So it is a great relief. We don't even pay attention to that. I mean, it doesn't even register. I don't feel any guilt. I don't feel any shame about not doing Valentine's Day or even Thanksgiving. We do it occasionally because it's the kids like the bourbon sweet potatoes.
Oh,
and once
I was just saying your kids like bourbon.
Nah, well they do. Well, one's 18 now, so there you go. But so it is in that way. We don't have to follow any of those rules, so it is kind of really nice in a way. I don't have to wash my car on Sunday. I could care less. Everybody washes their car. And before 17th of May here, everyone absolutely freaks out. I mean, everything is totally clean. We drive around in dirty old cars. And it's because we're utlendinga, and that's nice.
Very liberating, I would imagine.
Very liberating. And it's not being nonconformist. It's just that we're not part of the society.
Yeah.
And there is good and ill. I think some people might find that lonely. I, on the other hand, find it liberating and interesting. And I don't miss any of those things at all.
Yeah, that's quite interesting in the context of the conversation we were having just before about, people who are in minorities or are already different in some way. Okay, I'm going to be courageous. They can choose to see it as a disadvantage and get all prickly about it being named in a politically currently incorrect way, or else they could really embrace their differentness and take it as sort of license to be a lot more free than their colleagues and peers who already conform in many ways. So anyway, that was just a side thought.
What else did you do in your class then? You talked about nonconformity, but that's a fairly wide subject, and it's not just political correctness. What else did you talk about today?
Well, there was an article that we'd read called The Red Sneakers Effect, which there was a hypothesis that was given a fairly flimsy testing in research that people who have sort of natural leadership qualities or are sort of the alpha in a given situation are allowed to break the rules with impunity. But we weren't certain that always applies. And there can be, I think a lot depends on the context of it, that sometimes someone can, there's sort of a fine line. Like I've got a slide just in front of me here that we could see the nonconformist, whether it is that they're wearing red sneakers in an otherwise formal setting or whatever it is. We can see them as confident, independent, proactive, respected, principled, and courageous. But it could be a fine line between those things and annoying, time-wasting, arrogant, vexatious, self-centered, and stupid.
Yes. I think, but isn't that the difference between doing something with aplomb and dash as opposed to doing something for effect?
I think that's a very large part of it. That, yeah, if it seems to be done in a...
Didn't you
in a
tell
pretentious way.
Didn't you tell me that Bear Grylls went to your OBE ceremony in sneakers?
Did I say that
Yes, you
on
did.
air?
Yes, you did. Yeah, well, there are pictures of it too. There are also
That might
pictures.
be the example I talked about this morning in class. Yes, I did find a picture of him in his Union Jack slippers.
Yeah, at that very fancy ceremony with the Queen, right?
It was, yeah, it was a very grand party in Buckingham Palace for explorers and adventurers. So there were people there like Dave Attenborough and Michael Palin and Chris Bonington and, real legends who were all wearing suits, very, very much dressed for the occasion. And I don't know why it got up my nose so much, but I just felt it. But it did.
Oh, I didn't remember that part of it. I just remember that he wore those shoes. I thought that was pretty cool, but maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I wasn't there.
It may well say more about me than it does about him. But you see, one person's nonconformist can be another person, and I'm not talking about Bear Grylls here at all. One person's like admirable, courageous nonconformist can be someone else's pretentious whatever. So, I suppose you don't always know how it's going to land, but I somehow feel that if it's authentic, if the person, and of course, how can we ever judge what's going through somebody's mind? How do we know whether they're being authentically different or pretentiously different? We just can't know.
Oh, I don't know. I think there's a certain unself-consciousness that goes along with that. If it's a really, truly unself-conscious nonconformity, that they just do it because that's who they are, that you can tell in an instant. I had a student back in the mid-'80s who wore religiously every day the same style but different colors of leisure suits from the mid-'70s. It was the most fantastically uncool thing he could have possibly worn in 1986. And he knew he was doing it, but he did it every day, and it was really super well done, and he never batted an eye. And it got to the point where I really admired him. It was so cool. He was a total dork. He was a total nerd, this kid, right? But he did that with such style that he pulled it off entirely. And there are people that can do that.
Yes, and I think it's very difficult to define. You just sort of know it when you see it, I suppose.
Lack of just totally unself-consciously. I think that's the key. If you want to do it.
And I'm assuming that he did not set a trend, that the other kids didn't start showing up in these leisure suits as well.
No.
Because if you've seen that, it's one of those super short TED Talks, one of the 5-minute ones. That's I think it's called How to Start a Movement. And it's this short video of lovely sunny day out on the grass. One kid just stands up and starts dancing. I mean, and not dancing in a cool way. It looks more like he's having a spasm. But he's just, and I don't know how staged this was. But the point of it is that then someone else gets up and joins him. So now he doesn't look like the lone nutter anymore. Mm-hmm. Now he's started a trend. And before you know it, everybody's up dancing. And dancing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But maybe the point of it is, maybe the true leaders are the ones who will just do it anyway. Yeah. And they don't care all that much if someone else comes and joins them or not. They just have to express who they are and how they feel in that particular moment.
I think there are also people that don't respond to social cues in the same way that others do, that aren't aware of them. And that may be a sort of low-grade Asperger's. There is a certain sense of that, but I do think there are folks that just don't respond to social cues as well. Not as well. Well, well's not the word. They're not attuned to them as others are.
Yeah, I know at least one person who had to sort of teach himself how to respond appropriately in social situations. And in fact, on the plane, I watched The Accountant, which is somewhat relevant in that the fictional character played by Ben Affleck, is autistic, and when he's young, his father says to him, "You're different, and sooner or later, different scares people." Of course, he then spends much of the film carrying a large gun around and shooting people, which probably also scares them. That would. But it's funny how sometimes different does scare people or makes them uneasy, at least, but sometimes it inspires them. And again, how do we draw that line? When do we go, wow, that person's so cool. Look, he's a dork. He's wearing a leisure suit and he doesn't care. How cool is that?
I think that it's disingenuous. There's no attempt to steer. There's no attempt to influence. It's just that he digs, and he did. He dug those leisure suits. He thought he looked great, and he loved wearing them.
But if you remember when punk first started, I think people were quite scared of that until it became more mainstream. But I think people felt quite threatened by these loud, weird-looking, anarchic kind of people that were just so different from anything they'd ever seen before.
Yeah, but isn't that the goal of every teenager, to shock? Isn't it? I mean, again, this is the problem. What are you going to do? It's kind of the problem with society. If your mother and father both have tattoos and earrings and piercings, how do you shock them? Your goal is...
You become an accountant.
Yes, or you become a Republican. Yeah, I mean, how do you shock them? So that's if your goal is to shock, and that is a kid's goal, should be, they have to break away. They have to show you who they are. That's what jargon is about. It's about, learning all the right words that you're supposed to say and what's cool to say and what's not.
Yeah.
And when you don't do that, when you're outside that group of people, and I forgot what I was going to say, Roz. I totally ran aground on my own thoughts there. Excuse me.
Can't help you out there.
No, that's okay. It's all right.
But I'm wondering, who was the first punk? I mean, we could probably look in the history books and say it was Sid Vicious or whatever. But at what point do you decide you're going to cut your hair into a Mohican and
I don't know.
and rip your clothes? And
Iggy Pop is crawling around on broken glass already in 1972, 1973. Right? He's the father of the punks, as far as I can tell.
It was sort of a hypothetical question. It's I even remember the first time I ever saw Boy George on Top of the Pops. I was only 12 years old, but I was very disconcerted because he looked like a woman, he danced like a woman, he sang like a woman, but he was called Boy George. I didn't know what to make of him at all. And of course, now nobody would bat an eyelid, but I won't say that I was scared of Boy George. I mean, you can't be, can you? But I found him disconcerting, definitely.
Oh, that's right. You were from a fairly square background.
Oh, very square, yes. Yes, there were a lot of words that I didn't know the meaning of until quite an advanced age. But, in my defence, I think most of Britain was quite square in 1980.
Yeah.
Can I defend that? Anyway, that's sort of beside the point. I suppose this is coming back round to the question of, is it courageous to be nonconformist? And I'm still conflicted on this one because going back to our definition of what it means to be courageous, there's definitely an element of intentionality there. And as you say, when you are a complete original, your intention is not really to be a nonconformist. It's really just to be yourself. Mm. So, but I would say there is risk. By being different, you may well polarize opinions about yourself, whether you're aware of it or not. And we also, in our original definition, had the motivation to bring about a noble or worthy purpose, despite the presence of fear. And again, I'm not sure. It's difficult to know.
Yeah. No, I think that real nonconformists are there as, I mean, they are our canaries in the coal mine. In a lot of ways, they're the outliers, the people that that tell us when it's not working.
Yeah.
I think that takes a tremendous amount of courage. And if it is to stand up and say this is not working, or the emperor has no clothes, that is a very nonconformist and I think very brave thing to do. So in that sense, I think that we depend on nonconformity. How else could we know that we're conforming if you don't have that? No, honestly, if you don't have a scale, you don't have anything to measure it against.
Absolutely. And in fact, I wrote that in the blog post. Yes, I was partly saying, even though we somewhat praise and respect nonconformity, if everybody was nonconforming, society would just break down. It'd be a madhouse.
Yeah, well, then nonconforming becomes to confirm, right? You're conforming if everybody is non-conforming, then everybody is non-conforming. Then no one is non-conforming. Does that make sense? If everybody's doing it,
if they're all like non-conforming in completely different directions,
right? Then nobody is non-conforming because there is no standard. There is no.
Yes, you're right.
So there has to be
the contrast. What you were saying just a moment ago reminds me of that Gandhi quote about first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. We do need those outliers to.
They hold the mirror. Yes. They hold the mirror up to society.
Yeah, and actually, one of my students raised what I thought was a really fantastic point this morning about that sort of long dark shadow of fascism that I think still looms over us. That we're so horrified that something like the Holocaust could happen, that people seem to just conform to this evil force, that maybe that is sort of a historical reason why we look up to nonconformity and we really encourage people to say to call out what they see as being wrong with society, because we have this fear that we could still end up, goose stepping en masse,
marching in lockstep.
Yeah.
And the people who really celebrate nonconformity are the Germans. They have a greater appreciation for it. And if I could think of people that, in my experience, who have truly been bizarre, without pretension and were disingenuous about it, they were all German.
Really?
Yeah.
I suppose that's what the mental image I had of Germans. I suppose I imagined them all to be sort of engineers.
Well, they can be a fairly humorous, gray bunch of people, but there are people in that society that are very nonconformist. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. And do you think that is connected with 20th century history?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mm. And they allow it and celebrate it and are glad that it's there because they're not unaware of their own image, as being this fairly humorless, dark group of people.
It's quite a cultural legacy to inherit. Yeah.
Yeah, which they really aren't. I find that they are very funny in their own very dry way. Yeah. If you don't speak, the problem is if you don't speak German, you just don't get it because German is such a subtle language that most of the jokes that go on in German are very, very. They're not into physical comedy at all, but they are really into the inside joke and wordplay, and they find that hysterically funny. So,
See, I'd probably really enjoy that if only I could speak German.
yeah, well,
But it's been a long time, and certainly not to the kind of level of competence that I would need to appreciate the subtleties of their sense of humour.
but I do think, in my experience, that they really do celebrate nonconformity, and then with good reason,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
encourage it and pay for it. They in Gießen, Gießen had a Stadt Theater, and they produced operas. They had a stock company, and they produced operas and dramas and comedies. And they hired an American director, and he really did really terrible things, shocking things that were designed to shock. And every time that they would do them, he would take German classics and do them with East German twists, and just to shock the locals, right? It was so plain that he was doing it. Every opening night, because I had friends who were in the company, and every opening night, they would bring the musical director on stage, applause, 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 and they'd bring everybody on stage. Every time they brought the director on stage, the entire house booed.
Oh,
But they loved it. That's why they brought him there. They brought him there because they knew that he would hold the mirror up to them, and they celebrated that, even though they didn't like what he did. And I didn't like what he did because it was pat. It was, you could see it coming a mile away. It was disingenuous, right?
yeah.
But they allowed him to do it, and they paid him pretty good money to do it, and let him hire his own company to do those things. And it used to be every theater ticket sold in Germany is underwritten by, then it was 140 marks a seat per performance. It's expensive, and they pay for it right straight out of the budget of the state. So,
And this guy didn't mind getting booed every time he came on
he
stage.
celebrated it. He was glad, and I think the people in Gießen were glad that they had someone that they could dependably hate.
Yeah, we do need them, actually. Yeah, again, it's sort of like that bell curve, isn't it? We need our heroes, and it sounds like he was quite the anti-hero.
Yeah, he kind of was. He gave them someone to point to and say, "We're paying for you, but we don't like you."
Well, Vic, I think it's about that time
Oh,
for
my goodness.
producer Vic's conspiracy theory of the week.
Oh, gee whiz.
Um,
I'm sure this one is probably dear to your heart. How familiar are you with Agenda 21? The UN Agenda 21. Now, this one's a few years old, although it's still fairly active.
It's ringing a bell, but no, I can't say I'm familiar with it at all.
Yeah, what is... there's a UN organization, actually, well, they are a private organization, and I'll get to the funding in a minute, called ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. Do you know them? They're part of the International Council of Local Environmental Initiatives, and they are based in Freiburg, in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And they have Agenda 21 is a UN initiative to organize local communities, and this makes absolute perfect sense to me, for sustainability.
Seems pretty innocuous.
Seems absolutely innocuous and completely clear that you would want to have sustainable cities and towns and a sustainable society.
Well, I would.
Yes, except you didn't know that they are really out to control land use, and it's a communist plot to take over the means of production.
Why didn't I see that immediately?
Yeah, and see, it's connected to, and George Soros is one of the founders of the International Council for, I have to look over here, Local Environmental Initiatives. He funds part of it. He is one of the great bugaboos of the crazies, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
What's the problem with him?
Oh, he has funded a lot of environmental and sustainable projects. He also has had, I've
Yeah,
forgotten all the things.
He's got the Open Society International, which seems, as far as I know, to do a lot of good work. One of my former World Fellow colleagues was worked for OSI.
Yeah. So it is. He's one of the great Satans to those folks, and they see in Agenda 21, which would seem to me to be a completely reasonable and desirable thing to have sustainable towns, cities, and societies. And here's partly why. In the mid 80s, actually early 80s, two Rutgers University professors, a man and a wife, developed the idea of a thing called Buffalo Commons. Now, Buffalo Commons was the idea that from the 38th parallel, which if you think goes through, do you know where the Iowa-Nebraska line is? A little bit west of that. At the 38th, everything up to the 38th parallel, which goes through Grand Island, Nebraska, is everything east of that, it rains enough to actually have agriculture.
Oh, you mean...
Yes, the parallel, the line of, yes, longitude.
Those aren't parallels, because they converge at the poles. No, lines of latitude are parallels.
Oh, shoot, I'm sorry. Then the 38th...
Those are meridians.
Okay. Whatever.
Is that meridian? Yeah.
No, anyway. The 38th latitude. Latitudes go up and down. Parallels go up around. Anyway, the 38th...
Look, who's the ocean rower here? No, latitude.
Okay, whatever. Anyway.
So San Francisco's at 38 north, but you're talking about
38 north south. 38 degrees.
Right, that's longitude.
Longitude.
Yeah.
Right, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. That's Grand Island, Nebraska.
Is that 38?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyway,
I'll take your word for it.
Everything east of that it's so dry. It's so you can farm. Everything west of that to the Rocky Mountains is what used to be called the Great American Desert. So this couple came up with the idea of saying, we're seeing a decline in population out there in the Great Plains, and we think what we should do, or we think it should be a societal goal, is to buy out those people who live out there and move them all out and create something that they wanted to call Buffalo Commons. This was an academic paper they published in 81 or 82, and it absolutely made the Midwesterners flip out. They felt truly, truly threatened by this idea because they could see that the population's all moving out. It's all moving away from those places. And they felt at that point, so now for more than 30 years, there has been a kind of undercurrent that what's going on out there is unsustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know why? Because it's unsustainable. How do you maintain that level of agriculture out there without a huge investment in energy and resources? You can't. It's impossible. So it didn't work prior to 1931, 32, when it all blew away. And it's only worked since the mid-60s when they developed huge irrigation systems to be able to do that. So everybody could see this is not a sustainable thing. And I think everyone knows that. So there's been Buffalo Commons for the last 30-some years. And then of late, they've talked about something called rewilding. And that they are private individuals are purchasing large tracts of land. And in Texas, West Texas, on up into Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, with the idea, now according to the people who are paranoid about this, that those will be no-go areas for human beings. They're going to buy up private land that belong to people. You won't be able to go to your own private land. That they're going to designate them as human-free areas. And this is
like,
all...
Well, Yvonne Chouinard and Doug Thompson bought up quite a lot of Patagonia, didn't they? To keep it as a nature preserve, but I don't think they stopped people from going there.
I think the problem is that when it combines with a certain unconscious, perhaps, sense that gee whiz, my great-grandfather failed doing this. and and it's been failing since 1975, and everybody's moving away. The ones that are left are very, very defensive. And so when there's
Yeah.
Agenda 21 and those magic words sustain, and they've heard those words, and that's why people are very, very, very trigger happy about sustainability when they hear those words. If you wonder why it makes people crazy and makes them flock to Trump at all, is that those words are for them a direct existential threat to their way of life and to their, and you know, we have this great romantic attachment to the great American West. You know, all Americans have that.
All about freedom and cowboys and
Yeah, that's right.
a lot of archetypes there.
Right, and so that's all tied up with national and manifest destiny. And so that's all tied up together. So when you see something that may on its surface be absolutely reasonable, yeah, and I can imagine, I've looked at the website for the sustainable what's the name of it, oh gosh, what's the name of that thing that I just told, International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. It couldn't be more German. It is as straightforward. This is what we're doing. This is, you know, here you can sign up. This blah 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 blah. And I can imagine that they may be a little tone deaf to the knee-jerk craziness that's going to come. That's what happens. Is that you have to remember, this didn't happen in a bubble. That these ideas have been bubbling around and scaring the hell out of the people who live out there for more than 30 years now. And so when they hear the word sustainability, or they hear environmental initiatives, they hear an entirely different set of cues.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah, the associations that a word is not just a word, is it?
Right.
And some words particularly come with an entire history and a whole raft of narratives. And wow, yeah,
and
very.
I think that, you know, that that's sort of what we're seeing play out now, is that not poorly chosen words, but words that have been used as reasonable folks would use them in an academic setting or in an organizational setting, that when they translate down through the popular media and end up down on the front page of the Kearney Hub in Kearney, Nebraska, those words have entirely different meanings. And I'm not sure we have to be sensitive to that, but you have to sort of understand that's how it translates to those folks. Yeah.
That's quite a challenge, though, isn't it? You probably don't know until you provoke a completely unexpected reaction that you've used a word that's that emotive for people.
So loaded. Yeah, you don't know. And I think that again, it's not tone deafness from the left. It is, I think, a total. They're not aware of the historical context of the things that are said. And that may be a failure. I think what we have here is a failure to communicate, as Strother Martin once famously said.
Well, as the saying goes, half the world's problems are caused by lack of communication, and the other half are caused by communication.
And not just, it's not just the folks in the red states that are crazy. There's also, when I did a web search on Agenda 21, there's a site called Nytt Norge, which is New Norway, a nationalist kind of site that says, you know, that Agenda 21 is while we're sleeping, they've brought in a new law that's going to destroy our country. Blah, 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 blah. All just the same crazy stuff that you would read in the States. I don't know whether they're aping what they read in the States, but it's not just there, it's also here. Yeah, that people misidentify or misunderstand, or I guess in their own sense they see it. That's how they see it. So,
Vic, you're not cheering me up in the environmental context.
No, but I think that needs to be, you need to know that. I mean, I think everybody that wants to work in those things has to be aware that there is a historical context here that needs to be understood, that has been either forgotten or was never communicated.
Yeah, it just drives me crazy sometimes that, to me, there are very obvious and significant and human-threatening dangers coming very obviously down the pipeline straight for us. And meanwhile, we bicker amongst ourselves about where we should be putting our attention, which, is human nature. I know, but unfortunately, I think human nature is going to land us in an awful lot of trouble. And I imagine that an intelligence alien with any capacity to predict the future of planet Earth would be looking at the humans and just going, what the hell are you guys thinking?
I just also finished, there's a really interesting article that I read last week about the new growth of tribalism. And when you look at what's going on, it is the re-tribalization of society with all of its bad sides. Tribes have a tendency that they can be comforting and they can be inclusive, and everybody wants to be part of the gang. But those are gangs and those are tribes, and we all know what tribes are capable of.
Which brings us back to conformity, and
right.
We feel comfortable when we surround ourselves with like-minded people.
That's right. Didn't Churchill say once about the Germans, never forget the Germans are a tribe?
If you could send me the link to that article, I will include it in my blog post that will
have to look for it.
Go out with this podcast.
Yeah.
Also, just as a little factual aside, and this is completely the pedant in me, so I apologise, Vic, but I just did have to Google for the, obviously very approximate coordinates of Nebraska. I'm sorry, I spent all those years learning, celestial navigation. I was like, that's not.
It's the 38th degree that goes through Grand Island.
That would be the 38th parallel. That's the latitude, though. That's the horizontal one.
Oh, so it's not the longitude. What's the longitude then? Everything.
100.
Huh?
100.
Okay, the 100th then.
Yeah.
Yeah. I knew it was at 38 degrees something, one way or the other.
Because I was just going, if Greenwich in London is 0 and the international dateline is more or less at 180.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, does it? No, you're absolutely right. But
I'm sorry.
But that's the dividing line, and you can look at any climatic map of the United States, and you can see that break as clear as day. From that point to the east, it rains. From that point to the west, it doesn't, because you've already started to get into the rain shadow of the Rockies. Yeah. So that's why you get that. And that's why it was a sea of grass, I always said Nebraska had 7 trees and 5 stones.
And a lot of grass.
And a lot of grass.
I'm sure I must have driven across Nebraska at one point, but you got me intrigued now. I'll have to have a look, see if I remember any of the place names. I'd have probably been on the
western part of Nebraska is the world's largest area of grass-stabilized sand dunes. It is geographically a very unusual area. It's called the Sandhills. And it starts about Grand Island, about the 100th. Not parallel, the 100th what?
Meridian.
Yeah.
I think it's Meridian.
And from there west, there is this huge area that when the glaciers melted and the winds blew the first thing to fall out was the sand.
Yeah.
Right? And so when the sand fell out, it fell out right there. And that's what the Sandhills are. It's a very ecologically diverse and fragile area, and we have done our absolute best to destroy it for more than 40 years now.
Like many other wonderful, diverse and fragile areas.
Yeah.
Anyway, on that very cheerful note, yes. I really enjoyed the class this morning. It was interesting that, especially having some students who are either directly Chinese or of Chinese origin in the class. Conformity and non-conformity are very interesting topics. And I also did reassure them from, the vantage point of my tremendous age as I approach 50, that it is a lot easier to be non-conforming as one gets older.
It is.
It's one of my ambitions in life to be a cantankerous old lady.
Oh, well, keep hanging in there. You'll get it. You'll get there. Don't worry.
I like to think I'm on track. All right, Victor.
All right.
Have a wonderful and courageous week.
You too.
Folks, same time, same place next week.
Okay. Talk to you then.
Bye.
Bye.